Hi everyone, I'm here today with Anto from Icarus Games. Anto publishes D&D YouTube videos over his channel at Icarus Games, including GM tips, map making videos, world building, and many, many more. So if you aren't subscribed, what are you even doing? I mean, every subscribers that Anto gets from this video decreases the chance of a random encounter with a Tarask. So only you can save innocent adventurers on level 1 from certain death. That's all on you. Uh, aside from that, Anto publishes a monthly magazine that's called Sidequest. Each one contains 4 or 5 articles with new game mechanics, monsters, and plenty more D&D goodness. So there will be links for that in the description for this video if you want to check it out. But for now, Anto, thank you so much for joining me here today.
You're very welcome. Pleasure to be here.
So I thought our audience would really love to hear more about your process, especially when it comes to publishing your content.
Yes.
So could you tell us a bit more about Sidequest? How did it come to be?
Okay. So like a lot of we fellow YouTubers that make RPG related content, I had a Patreon for a good period of time, and I used to offer kind of just individual PDF things for my patrons for a good period of time. And over the course of maybe a year, I was continually trying to think of what can I do to offer more value to people, because you always want to give more value to your patrons. And eventually I settled on the idea of just bundling all of these disparate elements into more of a self-contained publishable document, which became a magazine, which became Sidequest.
So you took everything together and you packed it up nicely. Did you print those as well?
I printed a few issues for myself. So every issue I put out, I print a copy for myself to keep, to frame and stick up on the wall. And I wanted to print copies for patrons and for purchase. But when you're running really small print runs of such thin magazines, it is so expensive, and it just still doesn't make sense to have people be like, right, okay, here, pay like 3 times the cost of the magazine just to get this thing shipped out to you.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, eventually you could probably print a few of these and put them somewhere special for, I don't know, long recurring patrons, but when you have more people, eventually you can print them. That sounds so dreamy though.
Yeah, it'd be ideal for things like conventions, taking a bunch of printed copies to conventions, or bundling them together into kind of annuals. That might work, because that would be more cost effective. But certainly at kind of the scale that I'm running at, printing them for sale, it's so much upfront cost.
Yeah, I bet. So what were some difficulties that you had to kind of overcome to create these magazines?
The biggest one is time. Every month it's time. So when I started, from the point of having the idea of, oh, maybe I should do a magazine, to pretty much finishing the first issue was about 2 weeks. It came together very quickly. I reused some older content that I had. I wrote a bunch of new stuff, and I was kind of running off that pure new idea adrenaline. But then since then, it's been a constant battle of time. So there's been a couple issues where real life stuff has come up. For the majority of the time I've been publishing it, I was working a day job as well as doing all the content creation stuff, as well as trying to have some kind of life, and all of those things kind of grind up against each other, and trying to find the time to get everything done, especially when a problem comes up. So if something doesn't work out the way that you want, or an artist is late with art, or someone's late delivering a piece, it just grinds everything up into this meat grinder. But now that I've kind of quit my day job and I'm doing this whole content-y thing full time, hopefully things will be a lot smoother, and time won't be as much of a factor because I'll have more of it.
Yeah, and first, also congratulations for being able to do this full time. I know it took a long time to get to this point.
Yes.
And it's something that many YouTubers and content creators want to do, and you're doing it. So that's amazing. I'm really happy for you for having that.
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, time is a big thing. I feel that too whenever I publish things, every time I create a new adventure or supplement, it takes more and more time, and I'm like, I need to do this within a month.
Yeah.
And it's like, at some point you have to settle on, right, like this is what it's going to be. I know I can make it better if I had more time, but I don't.
Yeah, that's something that I kind of learned a long time ago in previous professions and things, that just published is better than perfect. And 9 times out of 10, when you hit the publish button, even if you think, oh, that's not finished, that's not ready, the majority of the time, most people aren't going to be able to tell the difference between what you publish and what you would have liked to have published. The kind of, a lot of that finishing detail really is only going to be noticed by you unless someone spends a crazy amount of time kind of digging into whatever it is you've put out in kind of the minute details.
Yeah, I guess that's very true. Something that I need to implement more often in my day-to-day. So what I'm really excited about is whenever I see like a video of Ashk or you talking about your homebrew setting. And I know that some of the volumes of Sidequest also feature Ashk.
Yeah.
So can you tell me and the audience a bit more about that world? How is it different from other D&D settings?
So Ashk started life as part of a YouTube series kind of talking about the process of creating a homebrew world, starting from nothing and then building all of those elements. And I think like most worlds it starts kind of generic, derivative, and pulling a lot more on the real world than it ultimately ends up being. And then over time, as you develop it, you start to lose some of the generic aspects and gain more unique things based on the things you're learning about your world. You lose more of that real world connection as you introduce more of the, in our case, fantasy elements to it. And it really is a process of, over time, the homebrew world kind of becomes its own thing. I would say that the biggest thing that makes Ashk different to a lot of fantasy settings now is that it is in the middle of an apocalypse. So when I started, it was very much a desert setting inspired by kind of the Middle East and North Africa, heavy on the tropes. And over time, a lot of those kind of tropes and lifted kind of real world allegories have started to fall away as the world has developed, as I've been playing in it and running my players through it, and their stories have kind of been shaping it. And now, thanks to player actions, they've started the apocalypse. So this setting is a world that's not post-apocalyptic, but it is in an apocalypse. The world is crumbling around the people of the present day. And that, I think, is what makes it different to a lot of other settings, because you either have your generic fantasy land or you have post-apocalypse. It's not very often you get that line in the middle of everything is currently on fire.
Yeah, everything's going to hell.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's a different campaign. Wow, okay. Yeah, but I do resonate with that, players really make a difference when designing a world. And it's not just players, it's having more people, more people you can brainstorm and get ideas from. I was lucky enough to be in one of your world building streams and throw some ideas in. And I think it's really beautiful how you go through that process and keep improving and discovering your world as time goes by. Yeah. So yeah, I really love everything I've seen so far, and I'm excited to see where you're gonna take that next. But with all that, I want to ask, what are the things that you personally enjoy doing that, like publishing your world? I mean, creating a world for our campaign, we can do that for our home games. What about publishing it feels special to you?
I think that for me, it's now become expressing the way the world changes. So because this is a setting that I am kind of developing alongside playing in it and running games in it, as soon as something changes, as soon as the players do something or I have an idea to incorporate into the game, that can almost immediately be reflected into this kind of ongoing development of the world. So because I publish pieces of lore for that setting every month in the magazine, when something happens in the game, I only have to wait sort of a few weeks or a month or two until I can reflect that in the setting, which is very much what has happened with the Apocalypse. I was only 2 or 3 issues into the magazine when the players went ahead and opened Pandora's box and made the world catch fire. And reflecting those changes in kind of the living publishing of that setting has been really interesting to say, okay, treat everything you've read up until this point as kind of a history. That was how it was before. Now things are very different.
I like that. So they can, so people who read that going through the different volumes can see like, okay, this is how Ashka is. Okay, oh, there's an apocalypse now.
Yeah,
that's interesting, and like they can kind of reflect that in NPCs or storylines that they bring or thought of bringing into the world as they read through it.
Yeah, and I think that the end goal would eventually be to kind of publish Ashk as its own distinct campaign setting. But the nice thing for folks that are reading the magazine is they kind of get to see it evolve to that point, and then they have that reference of, well, once it becomes kind of a finished product, they get to go back and look at all the different states that it was in and see how it evolves and how it changes and what gets kept and what gets lost. And then it becomes almost like little secret things of things that get dropped over the course of that development, which is really cool.
Yeah, all the little Easter eggs that people know. They just didn't make it to the final book, I guess.
Yeah.
So are there any aspects that you say don't really enjoy or enjoy less, or I know challenges that you thought that you didn't think you'd have to face when you started publishing your Homebrew World? So
the biggest one is kind of a cultural thing. As I said, this world started being inspired by kind of the Middle East and North Africa and that kind of region, and that world in its first instance was very generic. Is the closest word I can think of to being the correct one. You know, it would take elements pulled from different cultures around that region and different pieces of history and kind of amalgamate them into this kind of pastiche of the region. And as time has gone on, it's been a case of stripping back some of those lifted elements and creating something more unique as the world develops, and using those cultural elements less as a crutch and more as a flash of inspiration to go, right, this region might be based on a story from history, but how can we take the information that we now know about the rest of the world and make this a story that exists in that world, so it becomes more of its own thing, with a sprinkling more of kind of Easter eggs and references, rather than being something that just leans on existing things or other cultures.
So it was like taking the more general, even mythological stories that I feel like I can say that we have around here.
Yeah.
And instead of having them be a major aspect, like as is, it is a bit vague at some points, taking it and expanding it and putting your twist on it, on each of those.
Because I think it comes down to, at the end of the day, those kind of stories, those initial inspiration stories, those aren't my stories to tell. That, you know, that's not part of the world I'm from. That's not part of my inherent culture. So I want to be inspired by those, but I don't want to speak to those stories as they are, because that's not my place. That doesn't form part of my cultural background. I want to take inspiration from them, and I want to go, right, this is a cool story. How can I adapt that into my specific world without it becoming, I am a conduit for these stories, because they're not my stories to tell.
It's an odd thing, like to make that distinction between having my stories and being inspired by stories. So, like, I really like the Japanese culture.
Yeah.
And I watch tons of anime and read manga for things I like. But I think that even though I can be very inspired by many of the things I see there, and in many cases I am, I probably won't take things as is.
Yeah,
because it's
exactly.
something about it doesn't feel. Yeah, I think I can begin to capture that idea.
So I have an area in my homebrew world that is heavily inspired by feudal Japan, because that is a period of history that I'm really interested in as well. But what I'm doing with that part of my homebrew world is not to tell a Japanese story, because it's not my place. It's to tell a story in a fantasy world that has elements inspired by that part of the world, that part of history, that might speak to some of the broad events, but it's not to go really specific to speak to kind of the individuals kind of experiences, and don't want to take away from real people's experiences that you aren't intimately familiar with and you've not lived in. You just want to kind of hint at some of the broader things going on in that interesting point in the real world.
Yeah, like a lot of the ethos behind the culture. Like if we go to Japan, then perhaps and samurai culture, perhaps we can. It's more like taking the idea of honor and where and what's its role in society, and kind of use that to be a main like theme in our design.
Yeah, I think you take the kind of idea of the trope of a samurai, an honorable, noble warrior, and how does that apply to your fantasy land and the people's experiences in that, rather than pull in how it would have applied to the specific Japanese experience and then just put in that wholesale. I think that's definitely been one of the things I've been very aware of, and over time, obviously playing more in that setting, spending more time with it, spending more time developing it, I get to kind of take away the more carbon copy type elements and replace them with things that are deep and meaningful to that setting, and over time it becomes more of its own distinct thing, especially since the players caused the apocalypse. That's the kind of event that then becomes the slant. Previously, you might have categorized Ashk as saying, hey, if you want to play in a desert setting, if you've got this idea, if you have all these pieces of media set in that kind of part of the world that you're really into, maybe you could play this campaign setting. Whereas now it's, hey, you want to play in an apocalypse? This is the place for you.
Love it. It's wonderful. So you've obviously been doing that for a while. Can you share some tips with maybe some members of our audience who have just started and want to publish their own worlds out there?
So I think that the way I would suggest doing it is probably starting small and publish piece by piece, rather than committing yourself to, I've got this idea of a campaign setting that I want to publish wholesale straight away. Maybe instead look at areas of your world that could be used in other settings or people could easily adapt, and publish them over time, and then start linking those together. So that's one of the things I do in the magazine is I will take a city, for example, and detail everything out about the city. But you could take that city and put it anywhere else with very little work on your part as a game master. You don't have to know the kind of deeper lore of the wider world of Ash. You can just take that city and place it in your world, use the NPCs and things like that. And then over time, you start to build the bigger picture, so that then when it comes time, if you're interested in publishing a whole campaign setting, you've got all the little pieces already together, and you've kind of approached it from the mindset of, as a product, chances are people are going to want to chop this up and use bits rather than use the whole. Because I know that's something I find with campaign settings. If a new campaign setting comes out from Wizards of the Coast, my thought is never, right, I'm going to run in that setting. It's always, what can I cut out of it? And approaching the design from the making it so that people can cut things out. I think that people will be much more appreciative of that, because it makes it easier for them. It makes it easier for them to do what they want to do with the product.
It's very true. I see that many places. It also makes it more possible for people to easier for GMs to find it and use it. More opportunities for them to discover the rest of it through one product.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. I do think that there's, like, if I have to find a drawback to it, that sometimes making it accessible to that level limits the depth that you can go into and bring in.
I completely agree. I think that is the drawback, and that is the kind of trade-off that you make, is that if I put a city in Sidequest and I write it from the point of view of, this is something that someone could lift wholesale and just place in their world without having to do anything to it, that means I can't be putting things in there that they would have to necessarily change. It means that every NPC that's in there, all their relationships have to be confined to this space. You can't say, oh, this particular NPC has a relation with someone outside of this thing that you have to go somewhere else to find out about. It has to be contained. And while that makes it really useful for the end user, it does mean that you lose some of that depth. The way I'm kind of not getting around this, but the way that I address it in Sidequest is that I have specific kind of lore articles about the world. So there's an issue that goes into the Pantheon and talks about all the gods, presents them as a set of gods that you could lift and use in your game outside of the setting, but then other articles that talk about the world and the setting will reference those gods and say, right, this character worships this god, but that god is the god of the sun. So if you're running this in another setting, you have a reference point to go, okay, I've dropped this into my world. They don't worship that sun god, they worship my sun god, whoever that may be.
Right, and if you have made a homebrew race in one of your in one of the magazines, then you can have that character be like, okay, he can be of that race, but if you don't have that, you can use an elf.
Yeah.
Because that also works.
Yeah.
So I like that little tweaks. It helps us still have that depth, because I have that a lot of times. I have homebrew races and spells and creatures and spirits and a whole mess of things. And I like using them because I already wrote them. Yeah. But then I get what happens in my case is that I have like 3 or 4 appendices at the end of every supplement containing some stuff from older supplements.
So how I sort of approach that is, if I'm writing an article for an issue of the magazine and I want to use a monster from a previous issue, what I will tend to do is I'll say, this adventure uses this monster, here is the alternative, and here is where you go to find this monster. So this monster was published in issue 2 if you want to use it. Otherwise, just use this monster manual monster, which will do broadly the same kind of things. Maybe here are some tweaks to it, but it means that people don't feel forced into having to kind of get into a chain of products necessarily.
Yeah.
Because that's something that you can do as a bigger publisher. You can say, okay, here's a new product, use this monster found in this other book, we're not going to give you any information on it. But especially when you're a smaller publisher, you don't have the kind of assumption that people are going to have more of your work, so you have to kind of work harder to make those allowances and make sure that you're providing tools for the game master to be able to use that information in whatever setting they're using it in, or whatever kind of game they're running.
Yeah, that's true. I think that also for a big publisher, it's a bit of a not a very nice move to send people forcefully to other products. Even if you can do that, it's like, I already paid for something, and now seeing that reference, it can make people feel deceived.
Yeah, and
and we want to avoid that.
It can make people feel like they're not buying a complete product if it's overused. They can feel like, oh, I bought this thing thinking I could use it, but I actually have to have this second product to use it. But then it can also make them feel like they aren't a true fan. So if you buy a product and it says, okay, actually be able to use this, you're going to need 4 or 5 other products, but they've only got that one, it can make people feel almost inadequate, like, oh, I don't have all of these things, so in the eyes of the company I'm buying from, I'm not like the intended target audience for this product. It's a fine line to walk, especially when you are self-publishing stuff, because you can be very aware that you might be referencing something that is available as an individual product, and you don't want to just reprint that wholesale necessarily, because then there's no reason for someone else to go and buy that whole other thing that you put work into. But you also want to make sure that the people are getting the money for what they actually paid for. It's a balancing act.
Yeah, I very much resonate and agree with that. There's a delicate balance to walk there. So you mentioned earlier that you're planning to maybe publish Ash as a whole setting, as a full setting.
Yep.
So and I'm excited for that. I assume Kickstarter at some point.
Yes, it would be a Kickstarter at some point. Yeah.
Before you tell us more about that, I'm wondering if, aside from Kickstarter, if we're talking like a big dream now, where would you take that world if you could in the future?
Ideally, the kind of end goal for that setting is to be a big published book setting, something that someone can purchase into and run games in, which means that it would have to contain all the information that someone would need in a setting like that. It's something that I think that a lot of Wizards of the Coast products don't fully do, because sometimes you'll get a setting, but then they reference kind of the pantheon of another setting or kind of broader context from another book. Whereas what I would want is, here, if you've got the core rules of 5th edition, then this setting book is going to give you everything you need to run an adventure in this world. You'll know about everything to do with the world and kind of the broader context around it, and you don't need anything else. Just there you go, there it is.
Yeah, I feel like a book that did that quite well is Eberron. I feel like they also had an adventure built in, which kind of helps you get ideas or actually be able to run that if you want to. Generally, Eberron book is just wonderful, and as a setting, it's amazing.
Yeah, it does a lot of things differently, and it explains those things in enough detail that you can understand the kind of context around them, which I think is important. When you're building out a new setting and saying, here is what makes it different, you need to make sure that that is kind of reinforced in every part of it. So with Ashk as an example, this is a world in an apocalypse. That fact that the apocalypse is going on has to inform everything else. All the kind of cultural practices, how do they change when it's in the middle of an apocalypse? How kind of the structure of governments and all these kind of things, you have to keep coming back to that core premise. Otherwise, it just feels kind of tacked on and like a gimmick.
Yep. It becomes a pillar of that world. Yep. Excellent. Wonderful. Well, Anto, thank you very much for joining me for
You're
this
very welcome.
lovely chat. It's been so much fun. I can talk about this for hours, but we have to put an end point somewhere. So Anto, before we end this lovely chat, can you tell us where we can find you?
Yes, I can. So you can find me here on YouTube at Icarus Games, and just at Icarus Games across the internet. I'm on Twitter and Patreon and all the places, and I'm sure if you go outside and poke a bush, I'll be there. You can
I've checked.
find.
It's true.
I make videos here on YouTube. I publish Sidequest magazine over on Patreon, and I do a whole bunch of stuff.
And the links for everything that Anto just mentioned will be in the description below this video, so make sure you check it out. And until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Remember that you are awesome, keep being awesome, and we'll see you beyond the screen. Bye!
Bye!